Hi, this is Lauren Scott, and I was assigned Module 2, the Financing American Higher Education in the Era of Globalization, and more specifically focusing on the Finance and Policy chapter, Contemporary Perspective. So my goal with this presentation really is to kind of provide you a little bit of some of the key concepts of ideas. So I'm going to go based on decades. So we'll start in the 1980s. 1980s really is where we saw recession, high inflation rates, job opportunities really started to become a little bleak when we looked at new graduates. There was also a change of enrollment at institutions, so there was the last of the baby boom generation graduated, which then meant that kind of our population of 18-year-olds who would really be starting college started to decline. There was also a shift from the interest in liberal arts to professional programs. Companies were really wanting to see students who had a little bit more of those detailed skills, professional skills. And then we also saw an increase of adult student enrollment. So these changes started to kind of force institutions to keep up and adjust. There was also a shift. The article titled it A Philosophical Shift. So during this time in the 1980s, the human capital theory really started to emphasize the other private financial benefits for higher education. So people started to kind of question why, if a student is the primary benefactor for higher education, shouldn't they be paying more or most of the cost? So at the same time, is also when we saw the Reagan administration in the 80s argue that the responsibility of education falls upon the state. So you kind of had conflicting views, and we'll see that as a common theme throughout the article. We also saw a shift in the public marketplace, so really shifting from a public good to a private. And the U.S. News and World Report started their annual rankings in 1983, which really kind of perpetuated this shift. It forced institutions to be in a competitive market and start to raise their tuition to kind of keep up and adjust. We'll move into the 1990s. Again, the 90s they kind of started off the exact same way that the 80s did. We saw recession, we started seeing job cuts. However, this time they really were titled downsizing and right sizing because this started to affect more of the white collar kind of middle managers, where in the 80s we really saw it affect kind of the blue collar workers. So with this change, the college affordability started to shift. So what the focus was previously on kind of low-income students, and now in the 90s, the shift really started to be turned more towards focusing for that middle and upper class family. With that, we saw the start of the Georgia Hope Scholarship. This is, at this time, officially one of 15 states that have programs, but this program was the first broad-based merit aid program that was really launched in the 90s. It was funded by the state lottery, and the goal really was to keep the state's best students there. So they wanted to keep them home. The thought was really if we kept them at our public institutions here in the state, they might be more likely to stay in our state after graduation. And again, I mentioned that this was such a popular program that to this day there are about 15 other states that also carry this program or carry a similar program. The college affordability started to change. We saw the birth of the college or the Parent Plus loan, the unsubsidized Stafford loan. So there was really the start of a shift from grants being mostly used to now loans being used when we looked at federal funding, which really forced institutions to focus on some of that merit-based aid. But these programs were created as a result of some of the amendments to the Higher Education Act in 1992. But these loans, neither one had income caps for eligibility. And like I said, this really changed our shift for mostly loan borrowing for students. Student loans really started to become the way that our middle and high income families were able to finance college. So I also mentioned there was a shift in merit-based aid in the 90s. So again, the U.S. News and World Report kind of comes back to the forefront. They've had their best-selling issue that now features ranking. It focuses on test scores, class ranks, GPAs, the peer effects on education. So basically kind of saying that, the smarter the student that is enrolled, the better the education is from that institution. We also saw the rise of private consulting firms. They mentioned Noel Levitz most specifically, and these companies were really really there to manage institutions' enrollments. That's kind of common practice, and it helped keep institutions relative in this competitive market. But the statistics that were kind of coming out of these publications and consulting firms really divided the aid to attract the best students. So the emphasis on the 90s really brought up concerns that the selective admissions process, that most students who would be enrolled or would be able to be enrolled were now coming from well-educated and higher income families. The college demographics also started to change in the 90s. The mid-90s, the college-age student was rising. They anticipated enrollment growth that would last until 2007, and we saw what they called the echo baby boom. So children in the baby boom finally were children of the baby boomers were starting to reach college age. And most of this growth, while we did see a lot at public institutions, it really occurred in the two-year institutions. We also saw a little bit of a change in the economy. The economy had stock market increases. The environment allowed for tuition increases. So there were private fundraising, endowment managements that really were benefiting from the stock market. And now that the demand was there, so we have more college-age students, it really provided an environment that institutions had the ability to increase their tuitions. So we'll kind of jump into the 2000s. There's a lot going on in 2000, wars, attacks, financial collapse, and college really was starting to be seen as a necessity. There was the average tuition was starting to increase all the way up into double digits, but we did still see enrollment growth. We saw growth specifically in part-time students and for-profit colleges, which was something that I found to be a little bit surprising, that was where a majority of that growth was happening. Congress started to try to put in a little bit of accountability measures, so they started to express their discontent over the financial trends. On the federal level, there was talk that legislators really wanted to implement a mandatory 5% spending rate on those institutions that now had the highest endowment. It said that conversation had really kind of leveled out, but it would be interesting to see if that would come back around in the future. The economy, when we looked into the 2000s, saw lots of up and downs, economic bubble, credit crisis, stock market, and there was a little bit of legislation happening in this time that started to improve some of that federal student aid program once the Obama administration really took over. So this chapter was really thick in dates, thick in changes, a lot of changes in the economy and the finance. But some of the kind of main points that I think I took away from this chapter was that there really is a disconnect between the federal support and the state. So 50 states, we all kind of have our own approach to finance, and then the federal government is in their own world. So that's really one of the things that at the end of this chapter I saw that there has to be improvements in that communication and ability. There was a lot of adapting that happened, especially within the institution of higher education. They adjusted to the economy, the demographics, the technology, the political changes to really kind of stay relevant within all these changes. So kind of at the end of this chapter, I would pose a couple questions. My one question actually kind of goes back to the endowment. So we saw that in the 2000s, the stock market really soared. There was private fundraising. The endowment management was starting to increase, and there was talk that should be endowment spending rates. So while that talk has really kind of quieted down over the years, that's something that I still had questions about. So I was curious what if proposing an endowment spending rate is something that you would be for or against, and why you think that would be, why you feel that way. Another question I had at the end of this chapter was really based on history. What direction would you say the demand for higher education looks like for the future? So kind of moving forward, is the demand and need for higher education improving or declining? So hopefully that kind of shared a few of the key concepts, ideas, some of the stuff that I found helpful, and some of the questions that I would like to pose to you. Thanks.